So welcome everyone to the session Colonized by Data, the Costs of Connection. My name is Christopher Chagnon from the University of Helsinki Global Development Studies. Within the past 40 years, we've seen an incredible proliferation of technology, seemingly an ever faster advancement over the past 20 years in particular. Just within 20 years, we've gone from basic Nokias to souped up smartphones and smart everything. But of course, over this time, with this advancement of technology, which of course is what's allowing us to do this today, even in times of a pandemic, we see technology encroaching further and further into our lives. It's becoming integral to many basic daily activities and societal interactions. Of course, all this tech has a basic connection to extractivism. It is, increasingly driving demand for resources, for the endless stream of new devices and the ever-extending heavy infrastructure that's required to support them, not to mention the energy that is required to drive these devices. It's only relatively recently, however, that people have started paying more attention to what is being done with the data people are generating through these ever-proliferating smart devices and apps. Of course, I'd like to point out that this is a global issue. So much of the framing of this has been on the global north. But there are incredibly rapid rates of growth and proliferation of smart devices in the global south, with many major players in these areas being from the global north and from China. We've seen people call data the new oil in a lot of popular publications. Jathan Sadowski put forward the idea that it's more than that as well, like it's a new form of capital. It's not exhausted when it's used and grows more valuable with age and time. We glimpse that this new resource and how it's used is seen in the headlines, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, how it's used for political manipulations, for propaganda, how it creates echo chambers, how it can be used to spread misinformation and hate, how it can be used for political oppression, but how it can also be used for political resistance and human resistance. So it's more than just data. It's more than just a resource. It is us. It is our thoughts, our feelings, our movements, our desires, and our connections. So with that, allow me to introduce our distinguished speakers. We have Nick Couldry, who is a professor of media communications and social theory at the London School of Economics. And we are also very happy to welcome Ulises Mejías, professor of communication studies and director of the Institute for Global Engagement at the State University of New York at Oswego. They are co-authors of The Costs of Connection, How Data is Colonizing Human Life and Appropriating for Capitalism. We'll never leave home without it. So a huge, huge thank you to both of you for being here. And of course, thank you to Ulises for waking up early to be here as he's in New York. So without further ado, welcome and take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Yes, I'm Nick Couldry, and Ulises and I are really delighted to have the chance to participate in your EXALT Symposium today. We admire what you do within EXALT. We feel we have a special affinity between our work and what you do on broader types of extractivism. We too are very much concerned with questions of extractivism, and I hope you'll find the synergies and commonalities between our thinking and yours, but we look forward to your comments later. What we're going to do today is give you a brief overview of the argument of our book, Colonized by Data, which was published by Stanford Press a year ago. And really the question that we try to answer in the book, the core question, is basically very simple. The question is, what is going on with data? How, in the broadest way, should we frame the countless new and not so new developments with data that Chris was mentioning across business and government, across society as a whole, and the details of each of our individual lives. And these are developments for sure, which have been accelerated markedly by how we're all now living under conditions of pandemic, relying ever more on technologies of connection. Now, there are many ideas on the table for how to understand what is going on with data. Most of them emphasize capitalism. They suggest that we're in a new era of capitalism, which has been called digital capitalism, informational capitalism, perhaps more precisely platform capitalism, most famously surveillance capitalism, the concept of Shoshana Zuboff from the Harvard Business School. Also more literally data capitalism from Maya Schoenberger and Ramke, and also Sarah Myers West, Data and Society in New York. And those are all important proposals. We draw on them in the book. We take a lot from them. But in our book, we want to ask, is it possible that something even larger is going on with and through what we do with data? Something truly momentous in world history, a new phase in the relations between colonialism and capitalism. We get hints of the possibility that there might be a colonial angle to this in business cliches of recent years, as shown in that front cover from The Economist magazine from May 2017. The famous phrase they use in that editorial, data is the new oil. Obviously, oil being one of the classic colonial extraction assets. Is this phrase, data is the new oil, is it just a harmless metaphor? Or is this phrase precisely the cover for a genuinely new reality that deserves the name colonialism, but whose actual workings must be disguised if at all possible? Well, that possibility of a colonial framing to what's going on with data emerged in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which Chris also mentioned, which came out 2.5 years ago, as you no doubt remember. Cambridge Analytica, a small company that was able to use Facebook gathered data to draw up psychological profiles of hundreds of thousands of users and then target them, unknown to Facebook initially, with political propaganda. The key insider who broke the scandal was Christopher Wiley, an ex-employee of Cambridge Analytica. And a few weeks later, after the scandal broke, he was asked about Cambridge Analytica's attempts to influence politics in India as well. And this is what he said on Twitter. He simply says, "This is what modern colonialism looks like." So the question is, what would that actually mean?
So a central point in our argument is actually that this is not a metaphor. We are using the word colonialism not metaphorically, not as a visual illusion, but actually to describe an emerging reality. We are essentially talking about, like Nick said, a new phase in the relations between colonialism and capitalism, what we are calling data colonialism. This emerging phase is preparing the ground for a new mode of capitalist production, we're arguing. Just like colonialism prepared the ground for industrial capitalism, if we think about it in terms of perhaps the plantations, the haciendas financing the factories in early industrial capitalism. And of course, all of this is happening while coexisting with the neo-colonial legacy, with the inequalities that were created during colonialism, the legacy of underdevelopment, of racism, of violence. So this new form of colonialism is deeply continuous with the goals of the older form of colonialism. Now, are we suggesting that we can expect to see the same level of physical violence? Because that's what we think about when we think about historical colonialism. One of the most recognizable features is all of the violence that happened. And so here we have to say no. We are not making a one-to-one comparison between the old colonialism and the new colonialism, but we are saying that the impact of the social change is comparable. We are talking about perhaps different means, but similar ends. Allow me then to give you our definition of data colonialism as we frame it in the book. We say that it's an emerging order for the appropriation, extraction of human life so that data can be continuously extracted from it for profit. Now, in order to make sense of this definition, first thing is perhaps we need to understand a little bit the difference between colonialism and coloniality. Coloniality is a concept developed by the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano. And in summary, in brief, his point was that, okay, let's agree that colonialism is over. Countries got their independence. Of course, depending who you ask, maybe our friends in Puerto Rico would not be too comfortable with putting an end to that history. But generally speaking, there are no more colonies. But the legacy of colonialism continues to shape our world. It continues to shape power relations, race relations, even how we construct knowledge. So that's why speaking of the coloniality of power is still important and relevant today. So what we're saying is that there are differences between historical colonialism and data colonialism. Historical colonialism had different modes, different intensities, different scales and contexts. But there is one clear similarity, and that is the historical function of colonialism, which is the same. That function is to dispossess, to extract. The old colonialism grabbed the land, the people. The new one grabs us, our social lives, through the medium of data. So how is this new emerging order being rationalized or justified? Part of the reason it is very effective is because the new rationalities are based on old rationalities. So these new economic, legal, technological rationalities have a deep colonial past. Let's start with cheap nature. To colonize the world, nature had to be framed as cheap. It was said to be abundant. It was said to be free, just there for the taking. From a legal perspective, it was said to be without an owner, because of course the whole point was that the original inhabitants of that territory, that land and nature, were not civilized. So then it was okay for the colonizer to take over. That's why there was a concept in Latin, which means terra nullius, no man's land. It was the colonizer was able to arrive to a new territory and declare it his own. The next step after cheap nature is, of course, to conceptualize, frame cheap labor. Some human beings in colonialism, which was, of course, determined by race, they were supposed, meant, destined to provide the labor required to transform nature into wealth. So exploitation and abuse were thus framed as a form of social progress. People were told, we were told that this was all happening for the good of humanity. It was a civilizing order. It was bringing social, political, technological progress. We now come to cheap data, from cheap nature to cheap progress, perhaps bypassing a little bit cheap oil to cheap data. And cheap data is said to have many of the same characteristics of nature and labor, cheap nature and cheap labor. It's the same extractive rationality we saw with the nature and labor. It is said to be abundant. It is said to be free. It's there just for the taking. It is said to have no owner, at least in its aggregate form. Of course, we individually produce the data, but it takes a big corporation with advanced technology to collect and analyze and do something, process, refine that data. Now, of course, as Chris said in his introduction, there are some differences. We're told that this data is not exhausted when it is used. Perhaps we can talk about whether we think that's right or not. But we are presented with this scenario where our only job is to produce this data. And we're told that this is what progress looks like. What do we gain by looking at things this way?
So Ulises and I certainly recognize that it's uncomfortable. It's unsettling to compare what's going on with data today in the global north and the global south to the terrible history of colonialism, to the concept of colonialism. So what overall are the advantages of this approach as we see them? There are basically two types of advantage, advantages of scope and advantages of depth. In terms of scope, a colonial approach to what's going on with data means understanding it in terms of not just the past 40 years of the emergence of the internet, let alone the most recent 10 or 15 years of social media platforms, but thinking about the past 500 years. And it also means looking forward far into the future, seeing what's going on with data extraction today as a new historical form of resource extraction that builds foundations for the next stage of capitalism, just as historical colonialism paved the way for industrial capitalism, which emerged, of course, 200 years later. A colonial approach also widens our sense of the scope in terms of activities of what's going on with data. It means not just looking at the standard examples of social media platforms. It means looking at the massive expansion of surveillance across many forms of work and daily activity today. It means looking at the gig economy, which is a totally new way of putting markets together across platforms, relying on data management between parties to those platforms, such as Uber, of course. It means looking at logistics, on the face of it, a perfectly harmless aspect of contemporary business over the past 3 or 4 decades. After all, we all want our packages to arrive on time. But at the same time, the expansion of logistics means data collection, which is always also collection of data, not just about things, but about the human beings that move those things, such as the workers on the Amazon warehouse floor. And thinking about data colonialism also means looking at a much neglected source of extraction, which is internal corporate data. IBM is not often thought of as one of the key big tech players. It's certainly not fashionable anymore. But in their 2016 annual report, IBM said they weren't worried about being fashionable, unlike the big tech platforms, because from their perspective, 80% of the world's valuable data lay internal to corporations. And of course, that's an interesting phrase, because what is internal to a corporation may, if, for example, we own a smart fridge, include the details which are reflections of our own lives, such as whether we actually take milk with our tea or coffee or not. Those then are advantages of scope. It expands our view of what is going on with data. But a colonial perspective also deepens our sense of what is achieved, what is transformed in the social world through what goes on with data. We argue in our book that just as with historic colonialism, what is being built today through what happens with data is a new social order. New forms of dependency on platforms, on data extraction are emerging, which enable new ways of governing us as human subjects, always, of course, justified in very different ways in terms of convenience, in terms of customization, or what the marketers always call personalization. And all of this at the same time, like most orders in history, reinforcing inherited inequalities, which of course include the inequalities which are the legacy of historical colonialism, inequalities of race, gender, and class, as writers such as Sophia Noble and Ruha Benjamin have emphasized in their work. And then finally, an advantage of the colonial perspective is to help us see the deepest continuity of all between what's going on with data and a long history of colonial relations. We see data colonialism and its rhetorics, the language of big data, tech for public health, AI for social good, and so on. We see those languages as a fundamental continuation of the entanglements of power with knowledge, of power with rationality, that have always been at the core of the very practices, in fact, even the idea of modernity, entanglements which of course are also at the heart of colonialism, and as Ulises just said, the concept of coloniality. So those are the advantages. How then do we understand on a practical basis how this new social order is reproduced? To do this, we have to draw creatively on our best theories for understanding not just colonialism, but also capitalism. Because as we've said, what's happening with data is part of the ongoing relations between colonialism and capitalism. And for that, we need to go back to Marx, but in a creative way. As you'll no doubt remember, for Marx, the way that capitalism is reproduced socially is based in labor relations. It's based in the possibility that each of us have to sell in commodified form what each of us do through our bodies on a labor market, the commodification of labor. Obviously, that is still really important. And in fact, the datafication of labor is a very important part of DataColonialism as we see it. However, this emerging social order cannot solely be understood through labor relations, maybe not even primarily through labor relations. And the reason for that is that data is still being extracted from us, even in those moments when we know for sure that we are not working. Those moments when we're relaxed, perhaps at a weekend, we're having a meal with our friends and family, we're sending a picture of lovely images that are really of only private significance to our friends and family. At last, we are not working and we are doing what we want to do with those we love. And yet at the same time, data is being extracted from us just the same. So we must have a concept of the types of relation that make that possible, even when we're not working. And this means introducing a concept, as we do in the book, of data relations. Ways of reproducing social life, configuring our daily social interactions, whether or not we're working, for one clear commercial purpose, which is to optimize data extraction for profit. And we're able to develop that concept in the book by drawing on a radical Marxist theorist, Moshe Postone, who sadly died 2 years ago, who argued that at the core of Marx's theory of capitalism as a social phenomenon is not just labor relations. It's not even just the commodification that makes possible those labor relations, but it's something that makes commodification possible, which is abstraction. The possibility that from the messy flux of everyday life, something bounded and abstract can be extracted in a form that then can be exchanged on a market for profit as a commodity. And that possibility of abstracting from our life processes, things, data, which can then be exchanged potentially for value on the data market, or certainly used within business in that abstracted form, that is the core of what is going on with data today. And it's a form of abstraction exactly parallel to the extraction that Marx, if we read him right, saw at the core of labor relations. And this means this extension of Marxist thinking enables us to see that through datafication, our everyday social life in all its messiness, all its untidiness, can now become a direct input to, a direct factor of capitalist production. Just as happened, Marx says, with seeds, with manure, when agriculture became capitalized, joined the capitalist markets. The result is that human life itself is able now, for the first time in history, in all its aspects, to be annexed to capitalism. Through, of course, continuous monitoring and surveillance and influence over our lives, and in ways that we'll argue a bit later in this talk, threaten the very basis of freedom, threaten the very space of the self that we regard as potentially being free. How does this happen on a daily basis? Well, we all know in a sense how it happens, because every time we accept the terms and conditions of an app for our phone, or join a platform, or bring a smart device into our home, such as a fridge or a doorbell or a light system, every time we do that, we fall back into the spiral of data relations. we have to accept terms and conditions for the extraction of data by distant corporations. And of course, usually we do this quite peacefully. So this leads to a crucial point. You might be thinking, remembering what Ulises said a few moments ago, surely this is a huge difference from historic colonialism. There just is very often no violence in how we enter into these relations. How can this be compared with the terrible violence of historical colonialism? Well, there's a very clear explanation for this, which is that historical colonialism emerged on the basis of no prior social relations whatsoever between the colonizers and the colonized. Human beings barely recognized each other when they met, but then the possibilities of extraction became clear, which meant extraction was only possible on two bases. One, absolute physical violence, or deception. And of course, the colonizers used both. But today's new mode of colonialism, DataColonialism, can build on 2 centuries of us getting used to capitalist social relations. So that means that just a tweak in the background legal conditions that govern the operations of our phones is enough to change our relations to the flow of our daily lives and change our relations to capitalism. No physical violence is necessary.
So who is behind these processes that we are talking about? And in the book, Nick and I didn't want to just talk in general terms about internet companies or about specific geographic locations, perhaps like Silicon Valley or what's happening in one part of the world. So we came up instead with this concept of the social quantification sector. This is basically the industry sector devoted to the development of the infrastructure that is required for extraction. And some of the big players in this sector we might recognize. We have GAFA, or Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon in the West. But it's important also to point out that there are 2 poles to the new colonial global order, and the other one is China, where there are companies such as Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and Xiaomi, which are comparable in size in terms of number of users and definitely in terms of technological capabilities to the companies in the West. It is also important to point out that these big players function as hybrids of monopolies and monopsonies. Now, monopoly is a recognized word. Obviously, it means market structure characterized by a single seller, a market structure where the monopoly can set the prices as high as it wants. Monopsony is sort of the twin term, also from economics. And instead of a market characterized by a single seller, we have a market characterized by a single buyer. When we upload all of our media that we generate, it's usually to one of these big players, Google or Apple or Facebook, where we surrender or sell all of our media products. And of course, the main feature of monopsony is that it can set the prices as low as it wants, in this case, for free. Of course, there are other players in the social quantification sector. And here we could talk about hardware manufacturers, software developers, platforms that we mentioned, and of course, companies that perform the analytics required to extract value from this data, and who then package and sell this data and sell it to somebody else. So it's not just about surveillance. Let's talk a little bit more specifically at this point about this coloniality of data relations. And in the book, we actually conduct various transhistorical comparisons, basically using the past to understand the coloniality of data relations in the present. We organize these comparisons using the same 4X model, a game plan that is found in strategy video games. That game plan includes or is comprised of exploring, expanding, exploiting, and exterminating. So when you play video games, such as the one you see in the background here, Sid Meier's Civilization, this particular title, specifically dealing with colonialism, you have to follow this 4X plan to win the game. So in the game, you can play as the Spanish, the British, the Dutch, or the French. Of course, the colonized, the lands and the natives are controlled by the computer. They're not even sentient, they're just there for the taking. And so you apply these strategies to win the game. Right now, I don't have time to go through all 4 of them, so we'll focus just on 2. Let's start with explore. And here I want to compare 2 historical documents. The first one that you see here is from Google's Terms of Service for installing Chrome, their web browser. And in case, like most of us, you haven't read the Terms of Service, here's what they say in part. You give Google a perpetual, irrevocable, worldwide, royalty-free, and non-exclusive license to reproduce, adapt, modify, translate, publish, publicly perform, publicly display, and distribute any content which you submit, post, or display on or through the services. So as we know by now, when we install some of this technology, it comes at a cost. It asks us to surrender quite a lot. I want to compare this document to another one called the requerimiento, which translates from Spanish to English as something like the demand or the requirement. This was a document read by Spanish conquistadors when they arrived the New World and were about to conquer a village or a city. They would arrive sometimes in the middle of the night, unseen, covered by darkness. They would stand outside of the village and proceed to read this document in Spanish to a population that did not speak Spanish. And the document read in part, but if you do not submit to the rule of the conquistadors, I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command. And we shall take away your goods and shall do all the mischief and damage that we can. The Spanish Requerimiento 1513, please click there to accept and install. Now, we're not saying again that what happened after this document was read is the same thing that happens after you install Google Chrome. But we're calling attention to the use of this misleading and abstract language to conduct this trick of dispossession, of extraction. What about the exploitation, the extermination? And here I have in the background a document from the laws of the New Indies that dealt with the mines in the New World, where all the silver and the gold was extracted. What was interesting is that according to the law, the owners of those mines were recognized as the indigenous peoples of the New World. Of course, in practice, as we know, those mines were sites of horrific exploitation, where the lifespan of someone was 4 years. After they arrived to work in the mine, in 4 years they would be dead. So we want to talk about 2 levels of violence here. We have, of course, the symbolic level. And here we do say that data colonialism exterminates alternative ways of thinking and of being. And of course, we do continue to have the physical level. So data colonialism, as we said a number of times, continues this legacy of racist, sexist violence, of environmental and class violence as well.
There's one other aspect of our theory of data colonialism that I just want to summarize briefly before Ulises starts to wrap up our talk. And this is the deep impact of everything we've discussed on the human subject, on our conditions of freedom. And here I'm condensing quite a long argument in chapter 5 of our book. In that chapter, we ask, are there any philosophical resources that can help us grasp what is happening to us as human subjects through datacolonialism. What are the implications for fundamental philosophical concepts such as freedom? When we talk about freedom here, by the way, we're not interested in a thin concept of freedom, such as consumer freedom, because we're well aware there may be many market analysts who will say that the freedom to install this or that app, to choose what phone we have, to do on whatever platform we want is part of consumer freedom. In fact, it's a massive extension of the choices that were available to each of us 10 or 15 years ago. We're not interested in that thin concept of consumer freedom. Instead, we're interested in more philosophical concepts of freedom, and particularly not so much utilitarian individualist freedom, but the relational concept of freedom that has been important in philosophy for at least 200 years. One of its origins actually is in one of the writers who in many ways is scandalous because he was a celebrator of the outcomes of colonialism, which is Georg Hegel. Hegel's concept of freedom was a profoundly relational one because he argued that freedom is only possible in a world of social relations between you and me. But the core of freedom, as he defines it, is the freedom, as he says, to be with oneself in the other. That's a very complicated phrase. In the other basically refers to all those social relations which make possible any individual feeling free as an individual. But the core point is the phrase that Hegel almost slips past as he defines this relational freedom, which is to be with oneself. What does he mean by that? He means something very simple and fundamental, that the possibility of freedom is only there if I know that there are moments, as I think of whether I love someone or how I feel about the likelihood, the necessity that I will die, possibly soon, that no one is there between me and my reflections. I am with oneself. There is nothing nearer to me than myself. But of course, through consistent surveillance, that is possibly disturbed. That's a fundamental idea of the material basis of freedom in the nature of the self. And it's exactly that view, that relational view and that material view of freedom that we find in a writer who absolutely did not celebrate colonialism, the great Argentinian Mexican philosopher Enrique Dussel, in his philosophy of liberation, which was written precisely to contest the concept of the West, which is nonetheless still based in the concepts of freedom that, as he says, respects the natural substantivity of the person. There's common ground then between Hegel and Dussel at this fundamental definitional level of the possibilities of the freedom. And those concepts enable us to ask a key question about how data markets, market transactions, marketers' attempts to influence us through the data they have about us are affecting freedom. Because if I can no longer be with myself without some external system intervening, perhaps even a system I've chosen to intervene, such as a Fitbit, then am I really a self at all in Hegel's or Dussel's definition? What if surveillance, the continual surveillance we are now taking for granted, our options to self-track, the psychometric algorithms that are increasingly being used by employers and marketers and governments, what Karen Jung calls the hypernudge, what if all these are achieving a fundamental erosion of the minimal integrity of the self as a self, that basic physical infrastructure of my body and my mind, which makes freedom even imaginable? Now, let me just emphasize one thing. We're talking here about a very general change, and you might think, well, that's just something we have a luxury to think about in the West, maybe in privileged societies. But we're equally saying that it's this fundamental transformation of the conditions of all human freedom that makes possible the particular exploitations, drawing on the colonial past of those in particular races, particular classes, particular genders and sexualities, that is also a core part of data colonialism. In other words, specific exploitation in all their intensities go with the general transformation of the conditions of human freedom. The first is not possible without the second. So we need to understand both in our understanding of the difference that data colonialism makes for the conditions of human life everywhere and for everyone.
So just to wrap things up, we recognize that the message we're presenting here can be interpreted as rather bleak. So we want to end with some observations on different ways in which we can resist, just to continue this pessimism of the intellect, yes, but optimism of the will. Firstly, we need to recognize that this is a multifaceted problem, which amalgamates 500 years of injustices. So one-track solutions are not going to work, or solutions that promise to dismantle the system in a few months or years are not going to work. So yes, we need to continue to push our governments into regulating this industry, which is largely unregulated at the moment. Yes, opting out of particular platforms might do the trick if we can perhaps conceive of leaving Facebook or stop using Google, although in some cases it does seem rather extreme to do that. But by themselves, these strategies are not going to work. We need to recognize that. We also need to reclaim colonized space and time to protect, as Nick was saying, the space of the self. So the colonized space, perhaps invaded by cameras, by digital assistants in our kitchens or our bedrooms. The colonized time that we spend in front of screens. We need to begin to reclaim some of those spaces and times. It's very important that we also learn from past and present decolonization struggles. There are people who have been resisting colonialism for centuries, and we can learn from their experiences and their knowledge. The ways in which perhaps they have reappropriated certain technologies, built certain forms of common knowledge, new forms of solidarity. So it is very important also that we use a weapon here against colonialism that has always been very productive, and that is imagination. Decolonizing data is primarily an exercise in creativity, collectively imagining what this disconnecting looks like, and what new forms of connection also look like, something particularly important during a lockdown. And of course, I think overall what this means is that we need to reject this universal rationality of data collection and extraction. And for that, we have developed some proposals that we would be happy to discuss with you during Q&A. But at this point, I think we would like to finish and start to hear from you, the audience. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ulises. Thank you, Nick. So yeah, as I mentioned, at this point, we'd like to open it up. So if you'd like to ask a question, please use the raise hand function.
Maybe I can say here now that well, you haven't yet used the chat for questions. So
yeah, I've got. I mean, if so, yes, please raise your hands. I mean, in the meantime, I've got a zillion questions that I always like to ask to kind of kick things off. Well, I guess, Osi, if you got some questions, because Nick and Ulises were kind enough to sit down with Sophia and myself for the podcast, so we've gotten to ask a bunch of questions. So I mean, Osi, if you'd like to kick off the questions.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much for the really fascinating and relevant presentation. Yes, I have not yet read your book, even though I have it, but maybe, well, I have some different questions. Let's see which one you can maybe ask or provide some insights. First of all, maybe I've been now teaching this global development course, which looks at the world system for 5,000 years, not 500, as the Wallenstein's world system theory says. How do you see this? If we look at the 5,000 years of the world system, which means that there has been capital accumulation as the main driver for human activity since that, and the center-periphery structure inherent in the system, and the kind of hegemony, struggles for hegemony as the main kind of well, also big element of the theory. How do you see this? Well, now when you say about this like 500 years, which refers to the Western domination, if we look at the kind of more general level of accumulation, of different modes of accumulation, and now we see the hegemonic struggle between the US and the China, and which in your presentation was shown that there are two poles in this data world. So could you how does this colonialism, data colonialism, is shown in that kind of light?
Mm-hmm.
Good question. Who's going to start?
You want to go first, Nick?
All right. We obviously both have something to say about it. Clearly, we're interested in long-term approaches to understanding what's going on with data. And I think that's really important because so much of the debate is focused on very, very recent, almost instantaneous developments of this or that app. And we're looking at something much longer. So, of course, it is possible to look over the whole span of human history for anything to explain any form of resource accumulation. I don't think Marx would agree that would be a capital accumulation because he had a very specific definition of capital based around capitalist markets. What we're doing, in effect, is following those many critics of orthodox Marxism, which assume that the fundamental break in world and economic history was around 1800 with the emergence of industrial capitalism and the basis of national markets and so on, and commodification across large parts of the economy, which of course was only possible on the basis of the massive resource extraction of historical colonialism around about 1500. So already we're accepting that sort of way of arguing. Why stop at 1500 when we go back in time? Because that was the time when, instead of there just being a gradual expansion of resource extraction, which of course has gone on throughout history, and of course there have always been empires of various sorts, something new emerged, which was the possibility that one small part of the world, originally Spain and Portugal, then it became, because they were in a sense incompetent, with Britain and Holland, suddenly saw that the whole world was there for their extraction. They were astonished at the discovery. The new world had been discovered. It was a fundamental shift in history, which they had to puzzle over whether they were even entitled to take things, but they soon came up with rationales for taking all this. And those rationales were very much based, in a sense, of a superior rationality in what became Europe, became called the West, which somehow had the superior right to access what was there in the world for itself without consulting in any sense those whose resources they actually were. And that was a fundamental beginnings of modernity itself, within which capitalism occurred. So that's why we see that as the key break, because it contains the seeds of exactly the forms of thinking about rationality, which are at the core of dataism today. As even a popular historian like Yuval Harari argues, this is the core of dataism. this fundamental colonial core, this view of Western rationality. Go back even further and you miss that key break in history around about 500, the early 16th century.
Yes, I'll just add a couple of things, although I think Nick has sort of given a good overview of what our response would be. And yes, it's true that, of course, we had empires before the Spanish conquered the New World. I think the difference is, as Nick is suggesting, a new conceptualization of the entire world as resource there for the taking that began with the European conquest of the New World. And so I think, we can go back 5,000 years, although to me that starts to feel like, the whole Anthropocene argument, perhaps human life itself from the beginning has been bad for our planet. I think we want to focus our critique a little bit more. And to me, actually, the crucial distinction is not between what happened 500 years ago and in the last 500 years, but this distinction between colonialism and capitalism that we said a couple of times during the presentation. We want to explore that line because I think, at least when I talk to my students, the idea seems to be that colonialism happened. Yes, it was brutal. It was barbaric, and all of this exploitation unfolded, but then it ended. And then capitalism arrived and provided some good solutions, because now instead of slaves, we had workers. Now we were actually paying people a wage. So in some ways, I think that break between colonialism and capitalism is assumed to be over, and then capitalism, it might have its problems, but it's definitely an improvement over colonialism. And I think we want to explore that transition, because as we said, by now the research clearly suggests that the wealth accumulated during colonialism financed the factories, financed the emergence of capitalism. So we want to explore those connections and make it more evident that in some ways you cannot have capitalism without kind of extraction, without continuous extraction. Maybe that is in fact what defines modernity, but we want to be very clear that those two systems are connected. Maybe again, if you're sitting in one particular part of the world, it does look like modernity arrived with capitalism, all the problems were solved. But this is a constant reminder that that extraction, that exploitation continues, and it finances the new order. And we see that replaying now with data. That's why this argument is important to us, because at a time when we're told that we're achieving yet another stage in the development and the progress of this order, we need to explore and analyze how extraction and dispossession continue to be the foundations of this order.
Thank you so much. Yes. Yes.
So we have. Oh, sorry.
Yes, we have in the chat. What were you saying, Chris?
Oh no, I was going to say we have a few questions
Yes.
that have come in from the chat.
Yes.
Start. I guess William LaFleur, who messaged me to ask the question for him, says, "Thank you both for your really important research. You make a really compelling case. My question regards the work you've done here in connection with the recent work done on data by Jathan Sadowski, who, also using Marx, theorizes data as a new form of capital. It's also a really compelling argument. So if you are familiar with Sadowski's work, do you see it conflicting with your project here in any significant ways, or are both analyses compatible, or perhaps analytically useful in different ways?"
Shall I start on this one, Ulises? It's a good question, and it's an interesting question. Yes, we are, of course, familiar with Jathan's work. It's an interesting proposal. We're a little bit more cautious than Jathan, I think, because not only do we not say that we're ready yet to say that data is a new form of capital, because that will be perhaps the biggest theoretical claim you could make within the Marxist context. We don't even say that we're yet sure that we have a new mode of accumulation. We argue this is emerging and may well crystallize and stabilize what's going on through data, along with other forms of accumulation, as a new mode of accumulation. But Marx was operating over quite a long time scale in the way he saw change happening. So we're a little cautious about whether the evidence is out there yet to see us already in a change in the fundamental building blocks of the capitalist economy. Our approach instead is to look at the relations, the social relations that we believe are changing, because we're proposing a new type of social relation. So certainly what we're saying could generate what Jathan is saying as an outcome over the long run. We wouldn't see that as in any way inconsistent with what we're saying. It might or might not do. Having read his book and his piece, I'm not quite sure whether the evidence is there yet to make that bold claim he makes. Many people argue that data isn't always exchangeable. It's not always fungible. There are various reasons why it gets locked in particular corporations, because it needs to be transferred to other databases. There are all sorts of technical arguments. We decide to bypass that and concentrate on the human relations, the social relations which are involved, which we think are very clearly changing because we're involved in them every day. So it's a difference of emphasis, which probably in the long run may not be a fundamental conceptual difference. That's all.
Yeah. I think it's a great question, and I think Jathan does make an interesting argument for how data might be a new form of capitalism. I think, as Nick is saying, from our perspective, we're not so much interested in framing data as a new form of capital, but in illustrating how data contributes to capitalist, to this form of capitalist production. How data is in itself a form of abstraction, how data is a representation, an abstraction of our social lives that allows it then for capitalism to convert it to wealth. So maybe it's a minor difference, but I think it's an important one. Like Nick is saying, it allows us then to look at the social relations around this concept. I think that's where the basic difference would be.
All right, thanks. Then there's many questions now in the chat. So first, Nidia asks, says first, thanks for an excellent discussion. As he has a question, how can big data help us to reflect about new alternatives to overcome commodification on nature? How can big data help us to see new paradigms?
Do you want to do that one?
Yeah, I'm still reading the question.
Yeah.
I also wanted to say people should feel free to ask the questions, turn on the camera, and it's also good for us as the speakers sometimes to see some faces, so feel free to.
Yeah, definitely, please do.
But as far as Nidika, are you there? I don't know if you're.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm here.
Okay.
Hello.
Great. Yes.
Ah. Hi.
There you are. So can you help me understand a little bit your question? I think you're muted.
You're muted, yes.
So on my research, I'm thinking about the influence of big data in remote places, like in indigenous places where now big data are for example, in monitoring forests. A lot of the indigenous people are learning how to pass data of their territories to big places, to big platforms. So my idea is to think there are a lot of literature who talk about the control, the idea of the threat of big data as something that controls societies. But thinking about Marxist paradigm, so how Marx maybe was thinking in society and change and capitalism and commodities, for me it's just now big data. How can we use big data to think in no more a kind of no commodization of nature, to pass messages clear, like the last report of IPES 2019, there is a clear message: what are the economic services that indigenous people provide to the world? And this has been also provided through technologies and the big data of the global reports, where in many places there are fully explanations how these communities can help to support environmental needs. So my idea is thinking how we can use big data to change paradigm. This paradigm.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very interesting question. And I was struck, especially when you started by talking about how some of this data is being used at remote places. And it made me think of what was happening in colonialism, which was definitely a system where knowledge was developed for the control and management of territories at a distance. So technological developments, data itself was seen as a very important instrument for management. Colonies would generate the data would flow. Of course, back then we're talking about not digital data, but the data would then flow to the metropolis, to the center of the empire, where it would be processed and analyzed. And I think we still see that happening very much so in some of the projects that you're describing. And I know of various other projects which even involve citizen science, giving the people the tools to collect the data about nature, about their societies. And that data, in some cases, it's citizens themselves are empowered to analyze it, but more often than not, that data flows back to a big research center or a corporation like Google, and they do the analyzing, they do the explaining, the interpretation. So I think basically your question leaves, I think there are opportunities for both kinds of processes. I think if colonized subjects are empowered to use this data to interpret the world and act upon the world, I think that's great. But I think we do need to be careful about instances where this big data about the global south, about the rainforests, about the societies in danger, we need to watch out for how that data is being accumulated and becoming yet another resource for management. Nick, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I think that's good, and maybe relates to the next question, which was from Nora, about the reform nature of data, the possibility of using data positively. But maybe we could move on to that. I don't know, Nora, if you're wanted. Great. Hello, Nora. Thanks for your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
I'm taking that what you mean is the use of data for positive social ends, maybe by particular communities, which is a bit similar in a sense to the previous question from Nydia. Well, this is really important. And just to be clear, we are not against data in the book. We're very explicit. We're not against data. We're against a particular way of extracting data on a particular scale, on particular terms. And, you know, with my colleague at LSE, Alison Powell, I've written in the past about the possibility of gathering data from the bottom up, from local communities. And it will be a terrible world where we couldn't imagine communities choosing, they want to know aspects of their lives, for example, about the degree, what causes domestic violence, or what causes environmental damage in their street, and so on. The gathering of data could be very positive for community purposes. But of course, it's hard to imagine right now how to do that in ways that are entirely free of the commercial extraction, which is now the norm. So it's the norms of data extraction we're contesting. And yes, I think part of the resistance to data colonialism must include thinking about more positive ways of gathering data genuinely under community and social control. And that's why when we end the book, the point was on Ulises' final slide, we open the question about common knowledge. We go back to the great Mexican philosopher Ivan Illich and his idea of tools for conviviality and rethinking common knowledge on a genuinely communal basis rather than a corporate basis. And we argue this is exactly the way we need to think about the problem of resisting data colonialism in terms of collectively helping each other rethink the basis on which we could know the world and connect in the world, which are not corporate terms. That's the fundamental struggle of our age. And of course, put that way, it's a deeply positive one. It's not a negative one at all. It's extremely positive, and it is something people can do by using their imaginations on the ground. But the price is to rethink the framework which is being forced upon us at the present. So thank you for raising that point.
Thank you. And also just to reiterate what you shared earlier, I'm looking to the sort of extractivist nature in data in humanitarian and development field, and how much of data is being collected in remote areas, then forwarded to UN, NGOs, and further processed. So there is mechanisms that are really not working, but then there is also the reform nature that, and especially I think in Finnish scale, for us seeing how statistics can also, when statistics are sort of not so corrupted as well, advance issues. But thank you very much.
Well, you've just raised a fundamental point about development. Mika Madiano has talked about techno-colonialism, which is, although it emphasizes data less, it's an example of continuing colonialism through the ways that development is now being done. And I think a real key area for struggle is to convince the international NGOs, going right to the top, the World Bank and the UN, to take data colonialism seriously as a risk, because they have not done that until perhaps very, very recently. Some hints, they start to recognize the problem. And so much of what they do reinforces data colonialism on the basis of trying to do social good. And that's, of course, deeply paradoxical and problematic, but not new.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see, Kutu, are you there? And would you like to ask your question?
Hello, I'm here. Yes, I'm here, and I can ask my questions very briefly. My question is, does your explanation of data colonialism encompass data collection in relation to research for the purpose of research? How do we see data extraction in relation to research ethics?
Yeah.
Just for your reflection. Thank you.
Thank you, Gutu. I think continuing on what some of the previous questions, I think this is a very important issue. And while we would not sort of take the stance that all data collection is bad, we definitely don't want to say that. I think we're more interested in the specifics of who's doing the collection and for what purpose. I think we do agree with others who have said that there's no such thing as raw data. Data is always being collected for a purpose. And so our work, I think, tries to sort of untangle and make more visible some of those relationships. We should remember that, again, in colonialism, the construction of knowledge was very important. So data was never just accumulated for its own sake. It was, again, as I said earlier, for the purpose of management. And this included as well research purposes. So if we think of, for instance, I often make the case, these botanical gardens in Europe, which we all love to visit, many of them had as their origin a colonial enterprise, which was to catalog the plants from the New World, to study them, to extract them, bringing to Europe to be analyzed, and that knowledge would then flow to the universities, to the medicine programs, et cetera, whatever they looked like back then. So you're very right to point out that there's always this ethical aspect. I think in our argument, we tend to focus a bit too much on the corporate aspect, but of course, academia has always been part of a colonial process as well. So we need to investigate the ways in which that continues to be the case.
The next question was from Janina. Janina, do you want to ask your question face to face? Or?
Yeah.
Oh, hi.
Yeah, hello everyone.
Hi.
Thank you so much for this amazing presentation and for this very relevant research. My question is related to the research gaps and the next steps in terms of the priorities we should address, and if you think that academia can play an activist role as well.
Great question. Shall I start this one, Ulises? Well, gaps, I mean, in a sense, our whole book is an attempt to identify a gap. This too much debate around data has been focused on very recent developments, the minutiae or this or that data platform, which is important, but for us does not get to the core of what is going on socially in the ways we use platforms and in the way that platforms use us. So that's the first thing, to concentrate on social realities. And that does then open up these much bigger historical comparisons. And I suppose that links to another view that both Ulises and I have, and I've recently written a piece called Recovering Critique in an Age of Datafication, that so much apparently critical and radical work in the past 20, 30 years, particularly around actor network theory, some versions of science and technology studies, has put all the emphasis on analyzing the micro details of networks, precise configurations of technologies and people and assets, all of which is important and has freed up a lot of work in the social sciences, but very often ends up being descriptive. Very often ends up neglecting the core social function of what is going on through these very complicated interfaces, and has lost sight of the founding questions of social theory, which is about what is power? How does power work? How does exploitation work? How are bigger structures such as capitalism even possible? Those questions have been a little bit neglected in some of that technology work in the past 20, 30 years, seen as too crude, too complex, almost hubristic to answer questions like that. And we want to go back to those fundamental questions, which is why we do draw on writers such as Marx. As to activism, well, we very much believe that academics do have the potential for an activist role while we're still allowed to speak freely. And we're well aware that in many countries, academics are not allowed to speak freely. But insofar as we are, we do. And we recognize the obligation to use our speaking position to contest forms of power that we see. And Ulises and I have been involved in this year with Paula Ricalti, a Mexican scholar, in setting up a network called Tierra Común, which is aimed principally at Latin American scholars, but is designed to bring together activists and scholars in thinking about data colonialism and what can be done practically to resist it. And there's a website which I can send you links for if you're interested. And that's just one of the initiatives we're involved in. I'm sure, Ulises, this might be the chance to talk about the non-aligned tech movement that you put in the slide, but decided to hold over.
Yes, thank you for that question. I do think that, yes, hopefully we can continue to play an important role as academics, not just at an intellectual level in conceptualizing, describing models and theories, but in actually organizing and helping and being educated by other segments of society that have a very important role and voice to say here. So for instance, recently also I've been thinking about the emergence of a non-aligned technologies movement. As you might remember, during the Cold War, the non-aligned movement emerged as a group of concerned countries from the global south who wanted a third way, who were not happy with the offers of capitalism or communism, and who believed that there must be another way that we can govern ourselves. Of course, at that time, it was very much focused on the state as providing that path forward. In many cases, certain personalities, presidents within the states. So I think obviously we would need to build on the failures of that movement, learn from them, and to articulate a path forward that is not the one sold to us by Silicon Valley or enforced on us by the Chinese Communist Party. So a non-aligned technologies movement could hopefully start to help us speak with one voice, even though the solutions might be diverse, to at least put together proposals in terms of what technologies to use and how to research, how to understand what is happening with data colonialism, with data, and how to act and how to be in the world in new ways that don't represent those two models. Inka, I think you had a very good point too. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I wrote the question about like how plausible do you really think it is to compare the colonial history with all this horrible, violent resource and labor extraction to this now happening data extraction, because like it seems a bit rough because there is still a very big difference, but I understand that the time has gone onward and you can't kind of strictly compare past to the present moment. But on my opinion, it would be interesting to see some kind of framework where it would be more about this topic, that people are really at the moment willingly giving up their rights, because this is what is happening. Like people are clicking the accept button even though they kind of acknowledge that it might have some negative impact, and people are super short-sighted at the moment with many actions considering the ecological crisis. So kind of like, I understand that this is an important topic and you really need to draw attention to discuss about this data extraction, but yeah, it was just something I wanted to point. And also kind of like I'm studying in ecology, and there has been a lot of like this transition movement, and I was thinking that maybe the data could be more ecological compared to other kinds of resource uses. So I don't know how much you have put thought on these topics. Thank you for your presentation work.
Nick, I have something to say, but do you want to take a first stab at this?
Well, Inka, you're right. These are very complex matters. We're comparing a whole history of colonialism on the face of it with what could unfold in the next 2 or 3 centuries of data colonialism. So that's why we try and emphasize that all we're actually doing is comparing the beginnings of historical colonialism, that moment of extracting, appropriating the resources of the world, and Spain and Portugal saying, this is for us, this is ours, we'll take it, with the basic drive of today's appropriation of data. That's the comparison we're making. As Ulises said, many of the modes and intensities are different, but that's already a very important comparison as we see it, because it unlocks a whole lot of other comparisons which focus on that very idea that one part of the world has the right in any sense to grab everything else in the world. So that's the reason for the comparison. In that sense, it's a limited comparison, and there are many other differences. I'm not sure we agree that people do willingly give up their data. Many people argue that the concept of consent, on which, for example, the European GDPR depends, is almost meaningless in the age where there may be few other ways to connect with your friends except through a Facebook-owned platform. And yet everyone has a basic right to connect with their friends and family. So I'm not sure I would accept willingly I don't know, and maybe some of colonialism was willing too. I mean, some of the colonized gave gifts to the colonizers right at the beginning because they assumed they were more charitable than they were in reality. Complex.
Yeah, it is certainly complex, and I would say that the boundaries in colonialism have always been very permeable. It's easy to think just of colonies and metropolis, but of course, the colonized were always in the metropolis, just as the empire was always within the colonies themselves. So these boundaries have always been very difficult to define, and I would say that continues to today. When we're talking about data colonialism, yes, obviously it impacts everybody. So this is not something that impacts just certain populations. Of course, certain populations continue to pay a heavier price, just as they did in historic colonialism. At the same time, do we want to say that Donald Trump is a colonial subject because his data is being extracted by Twitter? Of course, no. There are people like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg, I'm sure also, who are not as exposed and their privacy is not as impinged on as the rest of us. I think to me, what's really important is that we should acknowledge that there is an element of active participation in this new form of colonialism. We're not just innocent, passive, helpless victims. We are, whether we're aware of it or not, and when we click the I agree button, we are surrendering certain rights or properties. Whether how much of that is truly consensual is up for debate. But I would say that more than just passive subjects, sometimes we are native informants, which was the role in colonialism of the person who translated, who served between the two cultures as a translator to basically generate data, generate information that the colonizers would then use to manage, administrate the colonies. I think we play that role. We are actively participant in it, and we play the role of translating our lives into something that the colonizer can use. So the power dynamics are very complicated.
There was one final question from Antti, and I think we have time for Antti to ask it. It sounds important. Antti, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hey, first of all, thanks for absolutely fascinating talk. Changed the way I think about the whole topic, so thank you a lot. The way you put the data into the middle of your analysis, it shows a different side of the relationship between Silicon Valley style economy and colonialism that I've thought about before, and I found it very important. But I wanted to sort of speak for the importance of having multiple ways of using critical colonial frameworks, and the question of violence, because you sort of indicated that this new phase of capital might not be as violent, or the violence is not as central or yet seen. And I would say that depends on the way you look at colonialism and what kind of colonial framework you use. So for example, my research, I've been looking at urban development of Silicon Valley style economy in conflicted cities, San Francisco, Oakland, and then in Israel, Palestine. And when you look at sort of the rise of this new type of economy from more settler colonial perspective, the Silicon Valley is in a settler colonial state. And you look at what happens in when these tech giants that gain their value by extracting the data, as you put it, but when they invest into the city, when they become real estate speculators, when they start to expel certain bodies from the cityscape, we see tremendous whitening of city scapes in places like San Francisco, Oakland, and what I'm looking at in Jerusalem, the expulsion of Palestinians from the city of Jerusalem with the help of the big tech and the new kind of economy. So I just want to speak for the importance of having multiple approaches to colonialism and using different colonial lenses, from franchise colonialism to settler colonialism, internal, external colonialism. But just wanted to offer this short comment, and thank you for a fascinating talk. Thank you.
Nick, you want to go ahead?
Oh, okay. Yes, that's such an important point, and I'm glad we're ending with this. How do we think about violence under these circumstances? It's a question we're asked after every time we do this talk, because it is so hard to get exactly right. So our precise words were no physical violence necessary. So we're not saying that physical violence can't be done in the name of data colonialism. And as you say, it may well be. And there have been many profound social conflicts in San Francisco over the clearing of streets, the changing of house prices, which in effect force people out of their homes or make homes unavailable and so on. So indirectly, all sorts of violence can be achieved or emerge in the name of, in the wake of enabling what seems so innocent, just the gathering of data. So you're absolutely right there. And then if you translate that into situations where, for example, as many have studied, data collected is used to deny people the loans they need to live, to get money or to get housing and so on in the credit market in the United States. These are almost violent forms of use of knowledge, almost violent. They're forms of force for sure. We tend to use the word force in the book as what we think is the normal mode of data relations. They're forceful. Sometimes they're violent, but of course at the same time we always wanted to avoid any implication that we minimize the atrocious history of the violence of actual historical colonialism, which is at the outer extreme of human violence, and in any way compare that to the very different quality of today's data relations. As Inka pointing out, they have a different quality, but they're no less forceful, and sometimes they come along with conditions which enhance real violence too. So it's a very complicated situation, as indeed original colonialism was very complicated as it gradually unfolded.
Yeah, I would just quickly add, I know we're out of time, but yes, thank you for that comment, Antti, and it's completely right. And as we suggest in the talk, I think what's important is to remember that the violent, might not be necessary, but it does continue, perhaps at a symbolic level, perhaps at a physical level, and it definitely impacts those same populations that have always paid a heavier price during colonialism because of the legacy. So when Nick is talking about algorithms being used to deny people loans, or when you're talking about gentrification and the displacement of certain populations, we're looking at those populations pretty much, as always, determined by race, determined by gender, by class. There have always been people who pay a heavier price for colonialism, and that continues during data colonialism. I know there's another event that people are waiting to join, right, Chris?
Yes, just one moment before everyone goes. Well, of course, thank you, Ulises and Nick, so much. But before everyone goes, we have a quick poll just to, just as a little bit of quality assurance. So if everyone could fill that in. So, I mean, thank you all for coming. Thank you all for staying. I mean, there's so much to get into here and just so fascinating, especially like tying in ideas of resistance and stuff like that. But, of course, hopefully we can get into that more next year in person. But yeah, just thank you all so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Great fun. We hope to see many of you in person in a better world next year.